Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lee Marsden. I'm the Head of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication Studies here at the university. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you as our guests and also our speaker this evening, Stephen Timms. We're very grateful for him coming. I also want to thank, because this is the last in the series of Keswick Hall Lectures for this year. We're hoping the series will run again next year. If you'd like it to run again next year, please make the right sort of noises and we'll make sure that it happens. And really are grateful to the Keswick Hall Trust for making these events possible and for you for attending them. One of the real important things we felt really when we were putting on these series of talks is the connection and the relationship between faith and politics in either a secular or sort of post-secular society. And it becomes particularly pertinent and relevant when you just think about the events that have taken place over the past few days. So obviously attacks in London yesterday, but also the death of Martin McGuinness earlier in the week and his funeral today. And that sort of propensity for religion and violence, but also for religion paving the way for peacemaking. And Martin McGuinness is probably one of the pivotal political figures of the 21st century. And his march, or his journey, if you like, from violence through to being an integral part of the peace process and really, the anchor of that peace process for many, many years, comes about through his connection and his involvement with key religious figures, particularly at Clonard Monastery, so Father Alec Reid and Father Jerry Reynolds. And the funeral today really did sort of mark an incredible sort of achievement and just how far Northern Ireland has progressed. And I think, the faith both of McGuinness, but also people like Arlene Foster, who was there and who was at the funeral today, speak volumes. People like Ian Paisley Jr., who could make the most gracious comments about somebody who was a sworn enemy of his community at one stage. And so those sorts of things which it's easy to take for granted, but that pivotal role of faith is increasingly important, I think, in our society and needs to be recognised and acknowledged. And in that spirit, we welcome our guest today, and Charles is going to sort of be in conversation with Stephen Timms over the course of this evening, the opportunities for question and answer. I hope you enjoy the evening, and I'm sure we'll all get a lot out of it. Thank you.
Lee, thank you very much. And can I just firstly echo Lee's thanks? Firstly, Stephen, to you for coming this evening, very much appreciated. And secondly, to all of you for coming this evening. The order of events this evening is I'm going to talk to Stephen for about half an hour, something like that, and then I'll open it to the floor for comments and discussion, which Stephen will respond to according to whatever you ask, of course. I'm really delighted, Stephen, that you've come. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for inviting me.
We first met when you were leader of Newham Council and I was on Hackney Borough Council. We then became fierce foes in the most vicious of circumstances, which is a Labour Party selection conference, where there was a by-election in Newham. And I thought, well, I'd give it a shot. I'd just about decided I wasn't going to be involved anymore and found the period rather dispiriting. And I thought, well, I'll come in. I'm sure I'll be able to be selected. Unfortunately, Stephen Timms overwhelmed me in the selection process. And that was my first defeat at your hands, Stephen. I'm delighted that you're here today in any case. What I'm going to do, as Lee implied, is ask Stephen firstly a bit about his life. These two dimensions, politics and faith, which have been very important in your life, Stephen. How did they come about? What informs your belief? And then I'll come to the interrelationship between these things that you've had to carry through. You've had a very distinguished political career from 97 until 2010, 98 to 2010. You were playing key government roles, including in the cabinet, in various responsibilities, mainly economic in orientation. Then shadow responsibilities from 2010 to 2015. You've been absolutely at the centre of national politics. And so I want to start really. You were born in Lancashire. Your father, I think, was an engineer and your mother was a teacher. And you then came down to live in Hampshire and went to school in Hampshire. And then obviously you were a clever boy and got a place at Cambridge to study maths and then I think operational research. Where in that process did politics become a point of interest to you in your life? Why did you get involved in that rather than the rugby club or whatever it might have been?
Well, politics certainly came before any interest in religious faith, really because the family was interested. And I was thinking, as I was driving here, I can remember when I was aged 8 and Harold Wilson became Prime Minister, there was quite a sense of rejoicing in our household about this turn of events.
You were living in Hampshire at that point?
Yeah, in Hampshire. Yes, there weren't very many Labour supporters in our neighbourhood, but we were there. And I think I just got interested in that. And actually, I think the way I supported the Labour Party was rather like the way that other kids supported a football team. It was that kind of enthusiasm that I had. And, that interest stayed with me. I didn't do anything about it at all until I moved to London, got a job in a computer company, came to live in Newham and decided this was an opportunity.
So at school and so on, at university, you weren't really involved in politics particularly. You were interested but not engaged.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And did you read a lot about it? I mean, you've ended up as a Labour politician, obviously. You've described your family relationship when Harold Wilson was elected. But might you have been a Liberal Democrat or a Conservative or
no,
God save us a UKIP?
I don't think so. I've always felt very strongly Labour. I read the newspapers. I wouldn't say I read much more widely than that. I did a maths degree, as you did, I think.
I did, yeah.
So, academically, that was where my interest lay, and I enjoyed my maths degree. But there was always that interest in politics. And I think one of the things that attracted me to going to live in Newham was a sense that if I did that, there would be a lively Labour Party there that I could finally...
Because it was a solid Labour area in politics, and so you likely to find people who you might be able to relate to. And you said you got more engaged in politics before before faith became an important part of your life. So at what point in your life did faith become something that was important to you?
Well, that was as a teenager. My family wasn't church-going at all. My parents, particularly my father, were quite cynical about anything religious. I think he had been a churchgoer as a child and lost interest. And it was as a teenager I started going along to a boys' Bible class, a thing called Crusaders, that my brother, a younger brother, went to first. And I followed on a week or so later, and it was there that I heard about the claims of the Christian faith, and after 2 or 3 years decided I wanted to sign up.
And was it always, I'll ask you later about, I think you describe yourself as an evangelical Christian, but I'll ask you later about your particular set of views, but was it through that experience you've just described that you became a Christian rather than in any other faith, or not a Catholic, or whatever? It was that particular formative experience for you with the Crusaders which took you down the path.
It was, and an important part of what Crusaders did was to say to youngsters, you should choose to follow Christ, and I decided that I would.
And was that then an active part of your life from those teenage?
Yes,
so
it was.
Again, going while you were at university.
Yes.
That was something you would do.
Yes, it was a big commitment, and when I went to university, I joined the Christian Union. I remember the first evening I was at college, I met somebody, we all went for dinner, and this guy was sitting next to me who was equally committed as a Christian. We both joined the Christian Union together, and that really became by far the biggest commitment I had outside my studies while I was there for the 4 years.
And would you say you had a fixed set of religious views, or were you having a discussion with yourself and with friends about what you might think? How were you, as it were, intellectually engaged in the question of how religion worked for you, or was it that the experience you'd had led you down a particular path which you basically followed?
It was probably more the latter than the former. I've always been interested in talking about religious ideas. I represent today a constituency where lots of different faiths are present. And so I've always been keen to have those discussions. But in terms of what I believe for myself, I don't think those beliefs have changed very much since I first decided to...
I'm going to come to that because, of course, Newham is a constituency with an enormous number of different faiths and different religions and different beliefs. And the question of how we build a multi-faith society, if I can put it like that, is one that I know you've been devoted a lot of thought to, and I'll come back to that particular point. So you went to work for a computer company, and you went to live in Newham because you thought it was an area where you'd find friends. Was it always clear that the computer company, the telecommunications company, was a short-term thing for you which paid the bills? Or did you think actually you might become a kind of a Gates-type figure or whatever, an entrepreneur? Or was entrepreneurship never part of what it was? Or was it just, as I say, filling the gap until you moved to another point?
It was a career.
Yes.
I ought to say that the reason, I've mentioned one reason why I went to Newham. The most important reason was that when I was a student, our Christian Union helped out for 2 weeks on a mission in Forest Gate in Newham. And we had a fabulous time. I'd never been anywhere like Newham in my life. It was rather different from Hampshire. And I really enjoyed those 2 weeks that we spent. And I got to know some friends. And so when I got the job in London, I needed somewhere to live, didn't want to commute from Hampshire. These were the only people that I knew. So I shared, I rented a room in a house that one of them owned. But I was expecting to have a career. I joined the Labour Party. I think anyone who joins the Labour Party thinks it might be rather nice if I was an MP one day, but I didn't seriously think that was going to happen, and it probably wouldn't had it not been for the untimely death of Ron Layton that led to the by-election that you mentioned.
You're being slightly disingenuous there because you're already playing a very leading role in the Newham Labour Party. You'd become a councillor, I think, in
84.
84.
Yes.
For, I think, the area you're talking about. Yes. As I know from my own experience, making the jump to say, actually, I'm not just a Labour Party member, not just going along to the branches, but I'm actually going to try and be a councillor is quite a big one. Well, and then even more than that, you became leader of the council for 4 years, which is a massive commitment.
Where I was living was the constituency of Reg Prentice. And so, and I think Reg Prentice had defected to the Conservatives in that series of events just prior to the 1979 general election. And when I arrived, the party locally was in a terrible state because it had been split down the middle, pro and anti Reg Prentice. The pro-Reg Prentice people had just about won, and then Reg Prentice went off and joined the Tory party.
And became minister in Margaret Thatcher's government.
He did. So the party was in a terrible state, and I think the fact that I rolled up and had not been involved in either of these factions, because I hadn't been around, made me a kind of appropriate person for someone to say, well, why don't you be the secretary of the constituency party? Exactly.
Clean hands.
Exactly.
So can I just explore a bit more this issue, what's driven you and your beliefs? As I said earlier, and I'll come to it again in a second, you played a major role in the Labour government over that period with a variety of different roles. You weren't just, in the way I've known you, I've never seen you as a person who just kind of held office and got on with it. You've always seemed to be quite driven by a set of ideals and values where the politics and the faith kind of overlap. How would you say you formed your own aspirations about what you were trying to do in the various roles that you performed in these areas, whether you were at social security, e-commerce, you played a big role as Financial Secretary to the Treasury, as a Treasury Minister, as I say, mainly on the economic side. But you weren't just a kind of technocrat who came along and happened to be lobbed into these jobs. Some people are, but that's not you. You formed a set of views that kind of drove what you were trying to achieve. Are you able to talk a bit about what formed that in you?
Well, I think it was largely, certainly my intention was that it should be my Christian faith. And I remember when I very first became a Christian as a teenager, thinking that there was here a set of ideas, a set of values which were politically very important and significant, and that I wanted to pursue and explore what those values meant in terms of politics. And of course, my thinking about faith and politics were very closely tied up, because I went to Newham, first of all, to take part in a mission. And when I arrived to live there, I joined the Labour Party. And that was a kind of a very formative time in my life. Left university, got a job, was becoming independent. And I was thinking a lot in those times, both about what I believed, but also about politics that I was getting into. And in the end, it's all about fairness. How can we build a society that is fair? And I think the commitment that I had to that came from what I believed as a Christian.
And that word fairness, you'd almost describe as the watchword of your beliefs that you sought to carry through into effect.
Yeah.
We had a discussion last week in this event about British values and what were British values. Was it meaningful to talk about British values or not? But you'd put your values coming from your faith, but then able to apply them in the context of being a Labour politician as about fairness and how you applied that.
That was always my aim,
For individuals, to what extent would you say you were concerned about individuals getting a fair crack? I mean, obviously as a constituency MP, that's a large part of what you do.
It is.
But you were talking about big structural issues when you were a minister in the Treasury, about the budget, about the tax regime and so on. And you consciously applied that fairness test to what you were trying to achieve.
Yeah, that was certainly what I was aiming to do. And there were plenty of opportunities to do it. One thing I vividly remember was when I was a Treasury Minister first time around. So this was in the lead up to 2000, turning up to work one day, and there was a human chain all the way round the Treasury of people protesting on behalf of the Jubilee 2000 campaign, demanding fairness for people in the developing world. And of course our government made very big strides in that direction and delivered those campaigners were calling for. Now that, for me, was a really interesting example where actually it was the churches who were making the running on that issue. The Jubilee 2000 idea had come out of the churches. The people organising that campaign, which called for the cancellation of the debts owed to Britain by the poorest countries in the world, the people who organised it told me that 80% of their activists were from the churches. And for me, that was a fantastic example of an issue that was about justice, about fairness, which the churches were making the running on and which our government was able to deliver.
Now, when you were in office over that period from 98 to 2010, doing the ministerial roles, which, as I know, are very time-consuming and engaging, were you able to give much attention to your preoccupations about faith and your role as a constituency MP in that area? I mean, I'm not critical of the way governments operate in saying you've got to be part of the team as you go forward, but there's not often that much space to follow your own personal engagement. Were you able to do that, or did you have to put that on the back burner while you were doing it?
I was a bit. I mean, you're absolutely right about the kind of the time pressures of being a minister. As a constituency MP, I did my level best to keep up the level of work and to be around and be seen and do my surgeries and so on. I was never quite sure how far I was succeeding. However, one thing that encouraged me a lot was that in 2010, I got the biggest majority in the country in the general election. So that was, I kind of felt, okay, well, I must have been doing all right on the constituency side.
Was that all down to Gordon Brown, or was that you?
Well, I claim it was constituency assiduousness.
Sorry, I was pulling on.
But on the faith side, there were, and actually Gordon, you mentioned Gordon, because I was briefly in the cabinet.
And he was genuinely a man who was committed to faith through his whole life. Yeah.
He was. I was briefly in the cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Treasury for a year at the end of Tony Blair's term of government. When Gordon became Prime Minister, he clearly decided he didn't want me to be in his cabinet, but
Very Christian.
he wanted to give me a kind of consolation prize, I think. So he told me that he was making me the Labour Party Vice Chair for Faith. And so that meant that I did have a bit of a locus to do some faith stuff. I did a bit before that, though not a huge amount. Although I was always involved in the Christian Socialist movement, now Christians on the Left, and I was I was on one or two ministerial committees in that, with a faith remit.
So after your very successful election in 2010, the biggest majority in the country, literally within 2 or 3 days of that, you had this appalling attack on you. You were in your constituency surgery in Beckton Library in Newham, and a woman attacked and stabbed you.
Yep.
And of course, with the terrible events yesterday, you must have that in mind. Your life was threatened. You were in hospital. People thought you might easily have died through this process. The woman who attacked you was subsequently found guilty of attempted murder. And it was a deeply, deeply shocking experience for you and for everybody, because of the accessibility of MPs to their constituents is a core element of the whole process. You obviously were totally shocked by it, but how did you deal with this attack on you? Obviously, your first thought was to survive.
Survive, yes.
But what are your reflections looking back on how you dealt with that? I think it's fair to say most people looking at the situation thought you behaved in an exemplary way, but I just wonder how you felt through that process and how it was.
Well, when it happened, the woman approached me. I was sitting behind a desk. She came around the side of the desk, and her hand was extended. I thought she was coming to shake my hand. That's how it looked. She was in sort of heavily Islamic dress, so somebody dressed like that wouldn't normally shake a man's hand, but that's what she appeared to be doing. But then I realised she wasn't. She was actually wanting to stick her knife into me, as she did twice. So I realised that that's what she'd been doing. Then she was restrained by my assistant. It wasn't absolutely clear to me she'd succeeded. It felt to me as though I'd been punched a couple of times. Nothing really much more than that. So I retreated into the bathroom, pulled up my jumper and discovered there was quite a lot of blood down there. So clearly she had succeeded in stabbing me. I became rather faint. I didn't feel great pain. I suppose I'd always assumed if somebody stabbed you, it would be a very painful experience. It wasn't particularly, just a couple of punches. I did start to feel rather faint. The paramedics were on the scene in no time at all. I was rushed off to hospital, and I don't remember a great deal about the couple of days that followed. I was absolutely inundated with messages of goodwill. What I particularly remember, because I'd never had this experience before, a lot of Muslims contacted me after that attack and said, "We are praying for you for a speedy recovery." And that meant quite a lot, that people felt that. A lot of Christians got in touch with me, said the same. And so, looking back on it all, actually, my sort of reflection on the contribution of Muslims in the community that I represent feels a very positive one, because there was such a strong affirmation from the community. One person who'd behaved in a way that clearly for them, for those who contacted me in a supportive way, it was extraordinary that somebody who believed what they believed would behave in that way.
Did you, after you'd recovered, it obviously must have been a difficult and time-consuming recovery process, did you just go back to your contact with constituents that you'd always had before? I know the House of Commons was looking at more security arrangements and so on, but how did you deal with the prospect of again being in a surgery in Beckton Library with people possibly?
I remember two things. First of all, the police were very helpful. They said to me, "Would you like us to put a knife arch up on the way into your surgery so that people can be scanned in case they're carrying things they ought not to be carrying?" And I thought, well, the trouble with that is it would just make the experience of going to see your MP so unpleasant that people won't come anymore. So I said no. I remember the first time I went back to the surgery, I did feel a bit nervous. But actually, in no time, you were talking about housing and immigration and all that, and the worries quickly disappeared, and there have not been any further issues in the 7 years since.
You were in Westminster yesterday, where PC Keith Palmer was stabbed, obviously not in quite the same way as happened to you, but in a not dissimilar way, and tragically died. What were your own thoughts about what was going on? Where were you while this was happening? Could you just tell us a little bit about events yesterday?
Well, it happened as we were voting in the House of Commons. There were going to be 3 votes. As you will recall, that each vote takes 15 minutes. I voted in the first one, and I was hanging around waiting for the second. So I went to the library to do a couple of things while in the few minutes that I had to wait until the next vote. And then I noticed that the screen in the library started saying "sitting suspended," which is a very odd thing to happen in the middle of the afternoon.
Unusual.
I went out and asked one of the doorkeepers what was going on, and he said there has been an incident. Didn't tell me any more than that. So I went back in the library and sat down. After a few minutes, we were told we all needed to move. By this time, there was a bit of news emerging that there'd been an attack. We didn't know how many people were involved in the attack. We were moved around. And we actually ended up, about 1,000 of us, in Westminster Abbey for about 5 hours.
A different faith context.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Westminster Abbey was very hospitable. The Dean welcomed us all. I mean, not that many places around where you can get 1,000 people, but Westminster Abbey was one of them.
Just explain why the police had kept you there in that way. What was their reason?
I think they were worried that there was somebody on the loose. That seemed to be their concern, because as they were shepherding us around, I noticed there were police marksmen sort of watching alongside us, presumably in case somebody emerged to do us some damage. So I think they must have thought there could have been someone else around. So they moved us to various different places, the lower ministerial corridor, Westminster Hall, eventually to Westminster Abbey, where we were sitting for about 4 hours, until they organised themselves to take a statement from all of us.
I think it's just to say I was Home Secretary at the time of 7/7, and the worry that the police and security services have is it's not a one-off, but there's a two-hit, because the attacks in Madrid had been a two-hit. If you don't know really who was doing the first hit, then the question is, what's the second hit that's coming? Yeah. And so they're trying very, very hard, irrespective of what's happened on the first hit, to deal with that situation. Well, that makes perfect
sense of what I was observing yesterday.
You must have felt, though, when you heard about PC Palmer having been killed in a not dissimilar way to what happened to you. It must have been deeply shocking for you.
It was. It was horrific. I mean, the whole episode was clearly absolutely appalling, and that one of the very friendly police officers in the House of Commons lost his life in that way was terrible. Tragic.
Just to go back in general, Lee mentioned Martin McGuinness, a very complicated life as a man, to put it mildly. Norman Tebbit, at Martin McGuinness's death, because the IRA had killed his wife, found it impossible to forgive McGuinness for his life, and indeed made some remarks about, as a lifelong Catholic, he hoped he'd live in hell for the rest of his forever. You had to consider to what extent Ms. Chowdhury, who'd attacked you and was then found guilty of attempted murder, to what extent could you forgive her? Was it something you could never forgive? Obviously, there's an important faith dimension in this, and people have to think after the attack yesterday what they think. Obviously, it's appalling, but what do they think after the event? How do you reflect after what has happened to you about these complicated questions of remorse, forgiveness, about the individuals? I mean, I don't mean the kind of political act, but how did you feel about the woman who attacked you, and what do you think of? Do you understand Norman Tebbit expressing that view that he did because his wife had been killed? I mean, how do you feel about these things?
Well, I remember being asked after the trial, "You're a Christian, do you forgive Roshnara Chowdhury?" And I thought about it, and I felt I wasn't bearing any malice to her. I certainly don't feel about her the way Norman Tebbit felt about Martin McGuinness, because in the end I'm absolutely fine. I don't bear any lasting ill effects from what happened. There's no reason
Luckily.
for me. Yeah, indeed. But there's no particular reason why Roshnara Chowdhury should be in my mind very much. When I'm asked, have you forgiven her? I don't think the answer is yes. The reason is, it seems to me, for forgiveness to happen and to mean something, there has to be some kind of communication. I don't think it would mean anything for me to say, I forgive Roshnara Chowdhury, because I have no relationship at all with Roshnara. I said to the police after it happened, after the trial, I would like to go and meet her, talk to her, find out what it was all about. And they thought to begin with that would be a good idea, but then they came back and said, no, we don't advise it. I think their view is that the only thing she regrets about the whole episode is that she didn't succeed, that she hasn't kind of moved on. But I don't think I can say, yes, I have forgiven her until there's been some kind of communication, which just hasn't happened.
So for you, forgiveness has to relate to a statement by the person who you're forgiving, of whatever it is, that they think they did something wrong in that area for whatever reason, and they need to acknowledge that for you to be ready to think about forgiving
I
them.
think it would have to be in the context of some kind of relationship,
Yes.
not in a complete vacuum.
Yes.
And there just is a vacuum. So the exchange can't occur.
Big deal. I mean, of course, with the wider issue of Martin McGuinness and his role in all this, there's been enormous debate. Many people here will have looked at it over these few days about how he's changed and what it was. But this question of how you address remorse, forgiveness, is a very important thing. I mean, Jonathan Powell, who worked, as you know very well, with Tony Blair on that, said yesterday he wasn't ready to shake McGuinness's hand when he first met him, nor was Alistair Campbell. Tony did, because he felt he ought to as almost a political statement. But and Jonathan said on the Today programme yesterday, I think it was, that he regretted not having been able to do that. But I think these things are extremely difficult to calibrate. That's why I'm asking
They
you
are
about
hugely difficult, and they very much dominated what happened in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And how you handle, and still do, I
and,
think.
and we may see. Okay, you have been engaged in a large number of faith organisations. You chair the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society, which is a group of MPs who are interested in this question, looking at the whole question of faith in society. You're active in Christians in Parliament, which has a national prayer breakfast every year, I think involving up to 700 different people. You've seen faith continuing to be as something you give your political time to try and encourage a better locus of faith in society. You describe yourself, I think, though correct me if I've misunderstood this, as an evangelical Christian. Could you just talk about how that belief relates to what you're trying to do in the faith organisations in Parliament? What do you see as the priorities? And I'm particularly interested in a point which must come strongly from your constituency background, of how you see the place of faith in a multi-faith society, how you can how you conduct the relationships, the values, in a way which is generally positive rather than negative. So could you just, Stephen, talk a little bit about those things?
I'll have a go. When I arrived in Newham, and joined the Labour Party, I remember thinking, I was a little bit worried that I would be seen as a bit of a holy Joe. Even then, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Newham was thought of as a multi-faith place. And I thought, I'm going to turn up, and people are going to think this guy is a bit of a holy Joe, and that might well be a problem. It turned out it wasn't a problem, and actually the reverse. So to illustrate that, in the run-up to that selection contest that you recalled,
Luckily.
I remember that the first person who came to me to say, we think you should run for this, I was leader of the council at the time, was the chair of the Alliance of Newham Muslim Associations. And he said to me, you believe in God, we believe in God, we think you should go for this job. And so actually that was the decisive influence really that made me think I would run. And so I've got quite a vested interest in the view that people of different faiths can collaborate and work together on community issues and political issues. The all-party parliamentary group on faith and society is made up of parliamentarians in the Lords as well as the Commons who take a positive view of the contribution that faith groups are making in our communities up and down the country, are concerned that sometimes those groups are not able to fulfil their potential for all sorts of reasons. Particularly there are difficult issues in the relationship between them and their local councils often. And our group exists to see if we can help them fulfil more of their potential than they've often been able to thus far. And so one of the things that we've done, the main thing that we've done, is to publish what we call a faith covenant. setting out principles as a basis for local councils and faith-based organisations of all kinds to work together on community issues.
Are you talking about the kind of issue where some public authorities have felt they ought not to fund welfare organisations if they're run by faith organisations?
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Because they think that if it's run by a faith organisation, it shouldn't be supported by the state.
That's exactly right. And I think often, particularly local authority officials, more than councillors, are worried that if they, for example, commission a service from a faith-based organisation, then one of two things will go wrong. Either the money will end up being used to try and convert people instead of for delivering the service which it was intended to be for, or the service will be delivered in a way that was biased in favour of adherents of that particular group, whichever it is. Now, I think in reality, insofar as there is evidence, and there is a little bit of evidence about this, neither of those things ever happens, or hardly ever happens. But of course it is conceivable, one of them could happen. And so our faith covenant, which is available on our all-party parliamentary group, the Faith and Society website, just sets out some basic half a dozen principles for the councils to sign up to, for the faith groups to sign up to try and provide reassurance that neither of those things will happen.
And do you believe that we are making progress in this area, or do you think there's still a large number of obstacles in the way that you describe?
I think we are making some progress. Birmingham City Council was the first to sign up to our covenant. We've got another half dozen or so that have signed up so far. We're wanting to promote it further, and I hope more will do. But I think what's happening in a lot of communities after 7, 8, 9 years now of austerity is local authorities looking around for who they can work with. The faith groups frequently are the only ones who are there. And I mean, I think what's happened with food banks is an extraordinary saga over the last 7 years, that lots of people have found they haven't been able to afford enough food for themselves and their families. And it's turned out that it's been uniquely that the churches, at times supported by other faith groups like mosques, have gathered food for church-based food banks. The Trussell Trust, every single one of their food banks is based on a church. It's turned out it's been the churches that uniquely have had the motivation, maybe that's not surprising, but uniquely they've had the capacity to take on the challenge of rapidly growing food poverty and do something about it.
You've mostly described the local relationship, the relationship with faith organisations and local authorities.
Yeah.
Do you see roles in relation to national government, which your all-party group is seeking to promote?
There certainly are relationship issues there as well. Our focus in the group has been on the local council relationship largely. But there is very interesting relationship also developing, I think, between faith-based groups and national political parties. I mean, one of the things that I've been interested in is London Citizens, which you would have known, I expect, in Hackney. Which is drawn from churches and mosques. There's a synagogue in there, other community organisations, trade union groups, that's just been reflecting on the experience of their members, came up with the idea of the living wage, which has now influenced profoundly all the political parties. So I think there are some very interesting issues at the national level as well.
One final question on the multi-faith aspect before my final question about a more political aspect. In terms of, you essentially were saying, perhaps I'm mistaking this, that the values of people of different faiths in Newham or elsewhere were really quite close to each other, and therefore people could work together. Is that a slightly optimistic view? I mean, is it in fact the case that the values of the Newham Muslim Association that you described, and the values of the evangelical Christians in Newham, and the values of the synagogues in Newham are broadly the same, and therefore there is cooperation? Or are there in fact some rather sharp questions in there which somehow need to be addressed?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. But actually your summary of my view is pretty accurate. Clearly the beliefs of all those different people are different. What I believe is different from what the chair of the Alliance of Newham Muslim Associations believes. But the values have a great deal in common. And certainly what I've observed is that those values, those shared values, do provide a sound basis for people working together, albeit their faiths and convictions are quite different. And something that often strikes me is that people say we're a multi-faith society now, that means we are fragmented. And you can well understand why people would take that view. But it seems to me actually that isn't the way things work. In a community like mine, which in the census in 2011 had the smallest proportion in the country of people saying, I don't have a faith commitment. So we've got a very high incidence of faith commitment in our community. What's striking about that is that the great majority of people belong to a church or a mosque or a temple. That doesn't mean to say they're necessarily there every week, but they have a sense of belonging, of being part of the community around that institution. And as long as each of those institutions is seen as part of the wider community, and to some extent it's the responsibility of people like me to make sure that they are, then belonging to one of them, I think, extends to having a sense of belonging to the community as a whole. So it seems to me what's happening in a community like mine, it's not fragmented as you might expect because of its diversity. It's actually quite a cohesive community because the great majority of people have this sense of belonging. And what the faith groups are doing is providing an opportunity to belong that across the UK, many, many people today do not have. So I don't think fragmentation comes because people belong to lots of different things. I think fragmentation is the result of lots of people not belonging to anything at all. And if people are belonging, actually that builds cohesion.
Very, very interesting. I mean, there's a massive discussion there about how things could move further. My final point is, after you left the front bench, and I thought I wouldn't ask you your attitude to the current leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, and why you're no longer on the front bench, as that would be an unfair and vicious political question, which I know you wouldn't want to deal with. You've become a member of the Select Committee, firstly the Select Committee on Education, but now the Select Committee on Brexit. So from last October, you've been charged with the responsibility of scrutinising government ministers and everybody else when looking at the Brexit process. I just wonder if you have any reflections. I noticed, for example, that in one of your parliamentary entries, you described the countries you're particularly interested in as Germany and Singapore, which I thought was an interesting combination. And Theresa May and Philip Hammond have said that we're going to set up a Singapore-style economy if we can't make an agreement in the whole approach, which I've always thought is a rather incredible suggestion. But how do you see the Brexit Select Committee? How do you see the Brexit process? Are you optimistic from a national point of view that we can find some exit from the European Union which will be reasonably stable, or are you pessimistic about that, or how do you see it all?
Well, so the reason I'm interested in Singapore and Germany is I'm married to a Singaporean, and I did German at school.
Right.
So those but I
thought they were the opposite ends of economic models in the world.
Well, it's an interesting contrast, certainly. I campaigned for Remain in the referendum. I think there are perfectly honourable reasons for people to want to leave the European Union, and there's a lot that is wrong about the EU, and there's real problems around democracy, I think, in the EU. But my worry has always been the economic consequences of leaving, and I remain deeply worried about those, and I cannot understand the sort of cheerfulness of government ministers about the process that we are heading into. I mean, they quite often give the impression that it's all going to be fine. I've spent a bit of time in Germany talking to parliamentarians there, said to them, look, what the British government is going to want is barrier-free access to the single market. That's what the phrase that the ministers use, but no longer to operate free movement of people. And they say, you can't cherry-pick. And even people who can't really speak English seem to know very well what cherry picking means.
What is it in German?
Did
you learn that when you did your
level? They just use the English for it. And they know it's a bad thing. And I cannot for the life of me understand how ministers can think they can get barrier-free access to the single market if we're not willing to give at least something on the free movement front. They don't seem to be inclined to do so. So I am very worried about where we're going to get, and I think we're we're going to find ourselves in some difficulty over the next year, 18 months, when the realities of this negotiation become clear.
I very much agree with you. Stephen, that's been absolutely tremendous. Now, we've now got about half an hour of people asking questions. I'm going to take them, if it's all right with you, in threes. Yeah. And I'm going to ask you, as you're asking questions, to identify who you are and what your interest is. And we've got a couple of colleagues with microphones. So could you indicate, please, if you'd like to contribute or ask Stephen a question?
Name Rod Spokes. Could you explain a little further how you deal with conflict between your Christian beliefs and the policies of the governments you've been in? You've passed through Iraq, MPs' expenses, funding of political parties, inequities in the tax system, etc.
My name's Tim Corkwell. I live in Eaton Road. I'm sometimes struck by the fact that I think we live in possibly one of the most secularized countries in the world, I think. And yet, we've got a Prime Minister who's, I believe, a church-going daughter of an Anglican vicar. Gordon Brown's father was a minister, I believe, and I think you've referred to the fact that Gordon Brown had a strong faith. Tony Blair, I think, didn't make secret, although Alistair Campbell wanted him to make secret of his faith. And Margaret Thatcher was the daughter of a Methodist minister and had a staunch Methodist upbringing. Is this just accident, or are there in fact a lot of MPs who have this kind of faith background which informs the way they go about business?
Trevor Mitchell, and I live locally. Both of you served under Tony Blair when Alistair Campbell made his famous statement, "We don't do God." And yet we know Tony Blair himself was very much a Christian, almost flirting with converting to Catholicism. And I just wonder what was behind that kind of statement. Why was it made?
Right, let me have a go. The question, first of all, handling conflicts. I talk to Christians a lot about getting involved in politics, and the impression I get in those conversations is that a lot of people who are Christians feel if they were to get involved in politics, then in no time at all, some great conflict would arise where their faith would say you should do this, the party whips would say you should do the opposite, and everything collapses in a heap and it's all a disaster. And actually, I don't think politics is like that. What you're doing in politics, what Charles and I have been involved with, it means that you're constantly making judgments the whole time. What's right, and what I would very much like to see is more people of faith being involved in making those judgments. And I've never actually been in a position where I felt faith tells me to do this one, the party is telling me I've got to do the opposite, and the disaster ensues. I think that what our faith allows us to do is to make those judgments in a good way, on the basis of good values. And I mean, there are times, for example, there are kind of classic issues like Sunday trading, where perhaps Christians might have a distinctive view because of their religious faith, which might be different from others, but there actually aren't that many of those. It's more, I think, the judgments about economic issues, about fairness, about all the political issues about justice that politics deals with, that faith values allow good judgments to be made. I think that's a really interesting question. Why is it that in such a secular society, all those leaders have got a faith background? But I'd go further. I mean, going back to what I was saying about food banks and the Trussell Trust, how is it that at a time when suddenly there's been this big upsurge in poverty, it's turned out that it's been the churches, uniquely, that have been able to take on the challenge and do something about it? not just been motivated to do something, but have actually had the capacity to deliver 400 plus food banks all over the country, which between them provided food for over 1 million households last year. There's nothing comparable that any secular organisation has done. And I think what that's pointing to is that actually, even in our very secular society, and in London, by the way, now church numbers are going up, not down. The pattern across the country is still, I think, numbers declining, but it isn't in London. And I suspect what we're seeing in London is probably going to be the pattern elsewhere across the country in due course. I think what that's pointing to is, where is the capacity for things to change for the better in our secular society? And I think if you look around, it's very often actually the faith groups where you see those hopeful things going on that inspire good politics.
We don't do God.
Alistair Campbell, we don't do God. I mean, on the whole, I think Tony Blair sort of obeyed the instruction that Alistair Campbell gave him, that he ought not to talk about these things. And, you know, why did Alistair Campbell give him that instruction? Well, because, you know, it's difficult territory, it raises awkward questions, you sort of, you know, there was that episode when Jeremy Paxman asked Tony Blair if he prayed with George Bush. You know, from Alistair Campbell's point of view, that's a complete nightmare getting into that sort of territory. Just avoid it, forget it, you know, keep out of it. And on the whole, I think Tony Blair obeyed it. But the reality is, good politics does require the application of the values that come from faith. Responsibility, solidarity, patience, persistence, compassion, truthfulness. Those are the values that we need to make politics work, and those are the values instilled by the practice of religious faith.
But there does seem to be an embarrassment to admit that. I mean, even with Gordon Brown, who you think might be more vocal, never.
Yeah, I think that's true, because as soon as you put your head above the parapet, particularly if you're a prime minister or something, and start talking about it, then there are lots of very secular-minded people around who will try and shoot you down. But you know what's interesting, I think, is I'm convinced that an important part of the reason for the electoral success of Tony Blair was because he talked in a kind of language and used ideas that were drawn from Christian faith. And it turned out they were very effective ideas. They provided a very effective language for communicating a political message successfully. So that didn't involve him standing up and saying, I'm a Christian, vote for me. But the ideas, the language, proved to be a very good way of communicating. Talking, you know, we talked a lot about New Deals. I think that whole thinking came out of the idea of Easter and new birth and recreation. There's a set of ideas there that work really well in communicating powerfully and successfully political ideas. And Tony Blair did that superbly.
Perhaps I could just add a couple of points. Firstly, on the one there, the lecture I gave in 2006 on faith, which was the first time I'd spoken about it publicly to the Royal Commonwealth Society, and I come as somebody who's not a theist, an atheist, in fact brought up as somebody who's pretty contemptuous of faith. I described how when I worked in the London Borough of Hackney with community organisations in Hackney, almost all the social welfare organisations in Hackney were run by organisations, by faiths of different kinds, immense different kind of range of different faiths, but they'd all committed in different types of ways. And I realised I had to reevaluate my position, because they weren't all doing it to recruit people or even to proselytise particularly, but it was part of their mission and belief of their particular faiths that they ought to be helping on social welfare, helping on education, or whatever it ought to be. And I had to accept that my set of views had been wrong. And so I gave this lecture saying that in general I thought religion should be regarded as a force for good, which on the centre-left in politics, I don't know if Stephen would agree, many people would not say that religion is a force for good. The Richard Dawkins' view is quite strong amongst perfectly reasonable people who basically don't get what's going on in religion. But I thought it was important to contest that view by proposing that religion should be treated as, generally speaking, a force for good. Of course, as I then said in the lecture, there's a set of questions you can then raise about areas where that hasn't happened. But I think the central proposition ought to be that people in religions, in faiths, are trying to improve society beneficially in the way that Stephen's been describing what he's saying. And I learnt that from that particular experience in Hackney, and that has then informed me in doing the faith debates. And in fact, there is an answer to the final question in the Westminster Faith Debates. If you Google Westminster Faith Debates, which I organised with a colleague from Lancaster University, Professor Linda Woodhead, we had what were called the Westminster Faith Interviews, big events where we asked somebody who was interfaith to be interviewed by a leading journalist. And I asked Delia Smith if she'd be interviewed, and she was prepared to be. And as you know, she's somebody who has deep faith. And the interviewer was Alistair Campbell. Why Alistair Campbell? Because they both like the football and all the rest of it. And we went through the process, and it was a very good process. And it's on the website, you can see it. But Delia isn't a kind of passive interviewee. So she said to Alistair, why did you say we don't do God in this process? And Alistair gives a very long answer, which is not dissimilar to Stephen's answer in the sense that the view had been that you want to keep religion out of the general political discourse, which Tony accepted. But he also has a long story about an interviewer who's trying to get an interview with Tony about his religious beliefs. And Alistair finally lost it with this journalist and said, we don't do God. And that was a situation which then got reported and carried through into the whole process. Anyway, if you want to see the interview, which is very entertaining, of Delia kind of counter-attacking on Alistair Campbell on this point, it's a very entertaining, you just Google Westminster Faith Debates and you'll be able to find the authoritative answer from Mr. Campbell himself.
A point about your Hackney observation of what was going on. Of course, our party has its roots very firmly implanted in non-conformist, the chapels, and I think it's important if we are to aspire to be government again, to take fresh inspiration from exactly the sort of phenomena that you're describing that I see in my constituency as well.
I couldn't agree more. Next set of questions, please. Hands.
My name is Stephen like yours, and I live locally. My question is, as a politician and a man of faith, how do you go about dealing with the situations while when you are faced with when you are faced with a situation whereby there is a conflict of duties?
So a conflict of duties, similar to the first question that was raised. The two gentlemen down here, please. Ladies coming from just behind you.
Oh, thanks. Is it? Yes, I'm David Miller. I used to teach maths. I live locally. Ever since I saw the picture of Earthrise over the moon, I have thought of spaceship Earth and the consequences of that picture and its impression on the world. And I wonder whether the terrorist is the modern equivalent to globalization that the Luddites were to industrialization. And that these are sort of massive forces that are not being addressed because of the pursuit of a profit through violence. The pursuit of a profit through violence, by which I mean the manufacture, distribution of arms. That we even used it in your language, to be shot down. Our whole society has actually developed from this, and we make money in our capitalist beliefs from pursuing the sale of things at a profit. To what extent should justice determine what is a just and proper profit to enable progress for the whole of the world?
Thank you. And gentleman there.
What benefit do you think there is to having faith-based community groups and organisations as opposed to secular ones?
Sorry, could you just repeat that? I got the last part of the question, but not the first.
What benefit do you think there is to having faith-based groups and organizations and communities as opposed to secular ones?
Very clear. Thank you. Stephen.
Right. The question, first of all, about the conflict. The point I wanted to emphasise in my answer to the earlier question is that these conflicts, in my experience, are much less frequent than people often assume. And I've been an elected politician now for just over 30 years, and the occasions when I've experienced the kind of conflict that you referred to have been very, very few. My worry is that people, Christians, from looking at politics from the outside, think that there are an awful lot of these conflicts, and that deters them from getting involved. I think if they did get involved, they would find that actually their faith prepared them very well for the kind of judgments they would have to make once they were to get involved, and that those conflicts very rarely arise. Now, of course, they do sometimes arise. I can think of one or two occasions when where we were heading as a party was in conflict with what I believed and the way I understood my Christian faith. I can think of one occasion in particular, and what happened was I went to see the leader of our party and said, I can't vote in the way you're going to require us to vote. And he spoke to some other people, and as a result, the three-line whip was lifted, and we were given a free vote to vote as we wished. So there are ways of handling these things that the party system recognises that there will at times be conflicts over areas of conscience and religious faith, and they can be accommodated. The point I really want to underline is that worries about those kind of conflicts are not a reason for not getting involved.
Gentleman's question about justice, the profit motive,
about the
parallel he draws between terrorist acts and globalization on the one hand and Luddism and industrialization on the other.
I think it would be a good thing. I mean, the arms industry is a significant part of our economy, not a huge part, but it is a significant part. I think it would be a good thing if the size of the arms industry in our economy was reduced. When I was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, we were doing a spending review for the following 3 years of government, and I was lobbied by the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, a Christian group called Speak, and the Fellowship of Reconciliation, that the government ought not to be subsidising the arms trade as it did through a particular arm of government which gave credit guarantees and that kind of thing. I listened to their case. My Treasury officials were with me, and I said to them, what do you think about this? And they went away and came back to me and said, we think this unit should be abolished as well. So we abolished it. I was very pleased about that. Unfortunately, the functions were then taken over by another institution in government, and I'm not sure in the end we actually made any real progress. I think maybe we made a bit of progress in reducing the extent to which the arms trade was being subsidised by government, but not as much as I'd hoped. But nevertheless, you know, there are opportunities to address that. And of course, the reason I got the support that I did from those Treasury officials is that in terms of economic theory, we really ought not to be subsidising that particular bit of the economy because it unbalances things, and economically it would be a more optimal approach to simply let everybody get on with their different businesses and see who did well and who didn't.
Could we not have armed police with tranquilizer guns rather than
guns? Well, we would have had a different outcome yesterday if that had been the case.
Not so actually
Yeah.
been a better
Yeah.
thing.
Well, yeah, it's a very fair point. The question about secular groups versus faith-based groups. I mean, I'm completely pragmatic about this, but I think the reason that we are seeing so many faith-based groups getting involved in doing things is that they are there and they're willing and they're coming forward with ideas and they've got volunteers. I was involved with some work for Demos a few years ago, and
A think tank.
The Demos
think tank.
Demos think tank,
Yeah.
that's right. We published a report about the role of faith in society, and they looked at the European Values Survey, and they did a correlation between people saying, I have a religious faith, and being volunteers in all kinds of different things. And what they found is, I suppose not surprisingly, that people of faith are far more likely to volunteer than people who aren't of faith. And actually, in quite a few of the categories of volunteering, about 1 in 7 in the UK, according to the European Values Survey, say, I am a religious person. In quite a few of the volunteering categories, those 1 in 7 account for more volunteers than the whole of the 6 in 7 who don't have a religious faith. And I think that just underlines the point that Charles was making, that you look at who's doing things, to a very large extent, it is faith-based organisations and people of faith at the moment. So I've got no problem at all with secular organisations taking these things on, but they're not there to do it.
And it raises a very interesting question about how one might encourage that. Traditionally, the labour movement, friendly societies, a whole range of different trade unions played roles in trying to do this kind of thing. Though actually often within that, going back to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, it was people of faith within the Labour Party who were actually doing that in that way. Yeah. When you look at the classic anti-faith societies, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Stalin's Russia, or whatever, you don't say, well, that's really the way to run society from this point of view, and going down a secular route. I think your question is a highly pertinent one and raises a very serious question for people not of faith. How can we get more secular engagement in societies and organisations of this kind? I haven't got a good answer to that question, because there has to be something within you which drives you to want to do this. And that's why people of faith do it, is they come to that view. But it would be excellent if people did more, and certainly I'm not in favour of suppressing it or particularly favouring faith organisations or whatever. But the actual reality, when you look at the situation, is in most places, the people who are doing that kind of voluntary work, as Stephen's just given the example with the statistics, tend to be from faith organisations rather than not. Yeah. We've got a few more moments. Gentleman here, lady up there, lady down here. Okay, well, ladies finally move in, which is great news. Gentleman there, this is the final round.
Hi there, my name is Oliver. I'm a PhD student here at UEA. One of the things you talk about is making good judgments. And one of the things you test to is actually your ability to make good judgments is based on faith. I'd like to be controversial now and say, well, that's actually a fallacy. Many people can make good judgments and don't have faith. I'm one of them. And when you talk about religion and you use the word capacity, faith-based groups have capacity. Well, under austerity in this country, a lot of people don't have capacity because of economic reasons and so on. And one thing I'd like to point out and sort of put to you really is that we're talking about morality and religion, where actually you can separate the two, that people without religious faith, like myself, actually do have a concept of morality, and whether there can be engagement between people who are secular and people who are religious.
Excellent question. Lady up there, please.
I'm Juliet. I was wondering how you think people of the same faith and who profess the same faith can end up with such different political views, and why that happens and how you can have a conversation between them without questioning the other's faith.
Another very interesting question, and the final one here, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Marion Princely. I'm a member of the very small Jewish community here in Norwich, and I live locally. So my question is whether you could just say a little bit about the rise in anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and which has led to many members of the Labour Party, like me, to resign my membership, and what thoughts you've got about what's being done to sort that out at the moment.
Thank you. Okay, Stephen, Oliver's question first, making good judgments. People can have morality without having faith.
Yes, of course, I completely accept that is absolutely the case. I think I would raise the question of how can we instill the values that lead to these good judgments? And it does seem to me in our society, given it's a very secular society, actually it is the faith groups that are doing the most in instilling the kind of values that everyone else can then share in. So I'm certainly not saying that only people of faith can make good judgments. And I absolutely do think that there is lots of scope for dialogue about these issues with people of every conceivable different starting point, and those can be very fruitful and productive exchanges. And I'm not saying either that faith-based groups necessarily will do a better job than secular groups if they take on a responsibility or a role. I am saying that actually it does, as we've both been saying, in reality it seems to be the faith groups that are willing to or have got the capacity to take these things on. You're right to say that in a time of austerity, that's highlighted this, because there would have been at one time, no doubt, lots of funding available for all kinds of organisations to do things. That funding is all gone, and what you're left with is the faith groups that have got a bit of resource, they've got plenty of volunteers, and are able to take some of these things on. That's simply a kind of reflection of the reality of the position that we're in, and I think actually they're doing a really good job, and we should value it. Juliet's question is a very good one. Of course, there are people who believe precisely the same in faith terms who reach absolutely opposite political conclusions. I remember when I voted in the first general election I was allowed to vote in, which was in October 1974, when I turned 18, I went along to my local church midweek meeting, and a man who I had a great deal of time for, a much older man, said to me, yes, general election tomorrow, we'll be voting Conservative, will we? And I said, well, no, actually I won't be. I'll be voting Labour. But in terms of what we believed, I think we probably believed exactly the same, but we reached entirely different conclusions. And I think what that underlines is that I certainly would not claim that any particular religious belief, what I believe, what others believe, inevitably leads to a particular political conviction. And I think we need to recognise that there will be widely differing views, political views, held by people who believe the same. I think it's important, though, that the values that I've talked about are in common, because they do enable a kind of dialogue which, if the values aren't there, you sometimes can't have either. So there is a kind of natural thing, and again, in talking to Christians, I've often picked this up, that people feel, well, if we believe the same thing kind of theologically, then our political views ought to be the same. But the reality is it's not like that, and we simply, I think, need to recognise that isn't what religious faith is about. And anti-Semitism, well, we've certainly had a problem in this area. I don't think our response has been a very convincing one. I'm very grateful to people like the Jewish Labour Movement who are continuing to do their work. And actually we had the faith reception. We do a faith reception at the Labour Party conference every year. The last one in September of last year, we had quite a big representation at the reception conference from the Jewish Labour Movement, and they were expressing a lot of exasperation about the position that they found themselves in. Of course, there are some difficult issues here. There are people who perfectly reasonably, like Gerald Kaufman, for example, take a view which is very opposed to the policies of the government of Israel. What I fear that some people do is take that opposition to a particular set of policies of a particular governing party into what is actually very clearly anti-Semitism. And that's, I think, the boundary that needs to be much more tightly defined and constrained in our party than it has been over the last year or two. And we've got a serious repair job to be done.
And I think there's no doubt that the leadership of the party has not taken on the issue with the intensity and aggression and integrity that is needed, and that's left Labour in an appalling position.
Yeah, I agree with that. Can I just say a word about Jeremy?
Yes.
As you,
I was not going to ask you.
As you intimated, I left the front bench when Jeremy became leader. But I had talked to him because he asked me to carry on the faith role that Gordon Brown gave me.
That's an aspect of the similarity between Jeremy and Gordon Brown of which I was not previously aware. That's very interesting.
He told me that he grew up with a believing father and an atheist mother, and the atheist mother read to him from the Bible every day. So it was a slightly confusing kind of upbringing. But
I think that explains a lot, actually. I think now I'm a lot clearer about Jeremy's clarity of leadership of the Labour Party at this time. Stephen, you've been tremendous this evening. Thank you very, very much indeed. Can I, on behalf of everybody here, thank you for coming. You've been inspirational and clear on a lot of very difficult questions. So firstly, thank you very much indeed for coming. Secondly, to thank all of you for coming this evening. I think we've had excellent questions, excellent discussion. Thank you again for coming. And thirdly, to thank the Keswick Hall Trust Foundation trustees for funding these three events. My own take on them, I don't know if Lee would agree, is they've been three really excellent debates, which have, not so much debates as discussions, which have illuminated a lot of very difficult questions in this area. Just to remind you that all three of these are available on the website. If you look at the Keswick Hall Lectures on the UEA website, I think I'm right in saying the last two are already up, and this will come up in the next week or so. And so if you want to go back on it or share it with anybody, you'll be able to do so. But thank you again to the trustees for facilitating this. You heard what Lee said at the beginning, that it's hoped to run this series again next year, and I hope that we'll be in a position to do that. But meanwhile, thanks for coming this evening and have a good journey home. Thanks very much. Thank you. Did you enjoy it?